Blackledger. Here's the uncomfortable question nobody wants to answer. When the shipping private equity Rollup collapsed, did the paperwork already know how it would end? Not after-the-fact press releases, not later lessons learned. The first document trail that made the strategy look intentional, showing that the sequence was framed before the money moved and before the losses could even be measured. Because in a Rollup, the timing is everything. The earliest timestamp can quietly reveal whether failures were an accident or a contingency built into the plan. Let's walk through the earliest paper trail that connected acquisition logic to funding mechanics and why one exhibit-style document changes how you interpret the collapse. Start with what investigators should always ask for: the first stamped exhibit header tied to the roll-up structure. In our case, the earliest record isn't a glossy deck. It's the kind of document that looks boring until you read the sequencing. You're looking for a header stamped as part of a transaction package, often labeled as an exhibit, schedule, or annex. The key isn't the logo. It's the earliest date and the first internal table of contents. On screen, imagine the exhibit title line, then a nearby section called Transaction Structure, Conditions Precedent, or Financing. That's the first place intent hides, in the order of operations. Now place it on a timeline. The roll-up story later describes acquisitions as opportunistic, but the earliest document assumes the opposite. It lays out steps to be executed in a planned sequence. Timeline test: if the exhibit is dated before any major funding tranche, before signed acquisition agreements become effective, and before consolidated results exist, then what you're seeing is structure before consequences. The collapse narrative will later say, "We needed time to integrate. Liquidity was temporary." But the first document is written like liquidity timing is already managed through pre-staged payments and contingent triggers. So why does this document matter more than later reporting? Because later reporting explains. Early documentation engineers. Think of it like this. The earliest record doesn't just describe a company. It describes a machine. How money routes, when entities transfer assets, and what must happen before the next step unlocks. What you want is the earliest record that links acquisition logic to funding mechanics. Not just we bought ships, but we bought ships when funding and settlement were contemporaneous. That's the difference between a decision and an installed script. Next, let's break down the language. Look for phrases that signal planned sequencing rather than improvisation. When you scan clause headings, these keyword phrases matter. Conditions precedent, to be funded contemporaneously, related party settlement, intercompany advances, payment routing, escrow, bank account control, drawdown, stage transfers, termination events, and covenant compliance. If you see wording like acquisition shall be consummated only upon or drawdown subject to, that is not casual. And if you see sanitized intent markers like seller financing to be repaid from transaction proceeds or intercompany settlement to occur concurrently with closing, that's sequencing dressed as logistics. Now the cash flow map beat. The earliest document usually includes appendices, schedules, or exhibits that function like a ledger by proxy. You may find references to a bank funding source, to a financing vehicle, and to intercompany flows between the acquisition entity and operating companies. Even when the figures are generic, the routing logic is specific. Watch for ledger fragments phrased like transaction proceeds paid to account controlled by, and invoices to be settled through intervened company accounts, and payments contingent on documentary evidence of title transfer. This is where the paper starts looking engineered. The document isn't only timing the purchase, it's timing the payment, the evidence, and the settlement, so that money moves in the path the structure requires. Now zoom in on the intent tell, friction points anticipated in advance. The earliest document doesn't wait for the downturn to discover problems like liquidity strain, covenant pressure, or asset transfer complexity. It anticipates them. You'll often see provisions that treat setbacks as expected variables, workarounds built into the mechanism. Examples of suspiciously pre-written contingencies include language around temporary funding shortfalls, springing security, replacement collateral, liquidity events, covenant waivers, or permitted indebtedness tied to specific integration steps. When the first exhibit anticipates friction and pre-authorizes fixes, you stop reading the collapse as random. You start reading it as managed risk, or a plan that only needed the market to cooperate temporarily. Skeptical check. Compare what later documents tried to claim with what the first document already structured. Later narratives often sound like necessity. We were forced by market conditions. We had to roll to survive. Integration took longer than expected. But when you return to the earliest paper trail, you're likely to see planned sequencing that assumes integration timing and payment timing align. If later reports blame unforeseeable liquidity disruption, yet the first document already treated timing as a controllable variable, then the story changed after the fact. The mismatch isn't proof of wrongdoing by itself, but it is proof that the early structure was not a reactive improvisation. Corroboration is where the investigation becomes harder to dismiss. Look for secondary records that align with the first document sequencing. Bank statement fragments can show when funding arrived relative to closing dates. Board minutes or exhibit-style excerpts can show the decision chain. Approval conditioned on funding mechanics. A stamped invoice or a shipping-related payment schedule can show that invoice settlement and intercompany transfers followed the written routing. Even a simple document trail, exhibit header date, then the next dated stamp on a settlement instruction can line up like dominoes. If the bank funding dates cluster around closing steps, and if intercompany settlements occur concurrently with those closings, that corroborates the earliest paper's implicit promise. The roll-up wasn't just built, it was sequenced. So here's the investigative lens you can take anywhere. Roll-ups can look inevitable after the fact, because the first documents are written to survive scrutiny. Once money moved, everyone can say, this had to happen. But when the earliest timestamp already frames acquisition, funding, and settlement in one choreographed order, it suggests the outcome was not waiting for reality, it was waiting for execution. And when execution meets a downturn, the plan can fail loudly while still having been designed to operate under controlled assumptions. Final CTA. Don't just read the collapse story. Read the earliest timestamp. In your own investigation, ask, what was the first exhibit header, first schedule, first term sheet, first conditions precedent clause that connected acquisition logic to funding mechanics before the money moved? Then search for those exact phrases: to be funded contemporaneously, intercompany settlement, payment routing, escrow, drawdown subject to, and stage transfers. If you want the controlled shock, the intent isn't in the final press release. It's in the first timestamp that arrived before the losses became visible.